Good afternoon, and thanks everybody for coming, those in person and a few online. We're very happy to have Jessica Lee today with us, and her talk will be on literary nature writing and the more than human garden. My name is Serena Zhou, and I'm an eco-critic and currently the chair of Farm for Change, Climate Eco-Poetics, and Earth Justice. This is an interdisciplinary initiative of the Institute of European American Studies, Academia Sinica, Taiwan. Our research lab is dedicated to the study of environmental humanities and resilient society. Since 2022, we have been hosting online talks and by writers, scholars, and activists from around the world whose ideas and actions have greatly changed how we think and act in the more than the human world. And for such reason, it is with great pleasure that we have Jessica with us this afternoon. Jessica Lee is a British-Canadian Taiwanese author, environmental historian, and winner of the Hillary Western Writers' Trust Prize for Nonfiction, the Borman Tasker Award for Mountain Literature, a Banff Mountain Book Award, and the PBC Taylor Prize Emerging Writer Award. She is the author of 3 books of nature writing. The first one, Turning. You have the Turning in the library, and the second book, Two Trees Make a Forest. And then the Chinese version is here. We're showing the audience and the camera. And the third one that just came out, the Chinese translation that just came out, was called Dispersals. And also the children's book, A Garden Called Home. Yeah, and she's also the co-editor of the essay collection Dog-Hearted. She also has a PhD in environmental history and aesthetics and was a writer in residence at the Leibniz Institute of Freshwater Ecology in Berlin from 2017 to 18. Jessica is also the founding editor of the Willow Herb Review and teaches creative writing at the University of Cambridge and the University of King's College. So it is great pleasure that we have Jessica with us today, and let's give her a warm welcome.
Thank you. We're just going to pop up the slides.
Okay,
sorry,
I want to say hi to
yeah, hi. I don't know where to look. Hi, everyone, and hi. Thank you for joining us today. Yeah, we'll pull up the slides and then I'll get started. There we go. Perfect. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Thank you. I hope everyone can see the slides online and in person. Thank you for joining me today. I'm going to use today to talk about nature writing, the idea of the garden, and the more than human, as my title suggests. But before I begin, I want to sort of situate us somewhat in terms of how I'm approaching this topic. So first, I think positionality is always very important. I feel like it's worth mentioning that I am, by training, an environmental historian. And in my scholarly work, I've focused specifically on histories of conservation, on parks, gardens, and common lands, and primarily in the United Kingdom. Prior to my doctorate, much of my work was in a really small philosophical subfield called environmental aesthetics. I did my master's work and a lot of my undergraduate work also in this area before my doctorate. And this is where, yeah, I conducted, much of my work really on embodied experiences of natural beauty. So this is sort of important for me to situate as just kind of key concerns that are always there in the background for me as a historian, as a writer, as a practitioner, which is to say, as a historian, I bring this kind of focus on aesthetics and phenomenological embodiment to bear. a little bit more situating. At the end of my doctorate, I chose not to pursue a full-time career in academia, but rather that of a literary nature writer. So I was in a sort of funny position towards the end of my doctorate because I'd gotten my first book deal in the last year of my PhD. So I will also say I don't recommend this to anyone, but I had to finish writing my dissertation at the same time as I was writing my first book. They were due a month apart. Don't do that. Don't do that. If that's an option. Oh, someone has a copy of Turning. Perfect. Yeah, there we go. Yeah. If it seems like it was labored, yeah. So this one's Catherine's copy. I think we can pass it. Is it okay if we pass it around, Catherine? I'm going to hold on to this one for a minute, but I can pass two trees around. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, at the end of my doctorate, I chose not to pursue that full-time career, and instead decided to really focus on my career as a writer in a sort of more creative frame, taking, I think, many of the research skills that I had developed in my academic training into a publishing world, which at the time, it felt kind of foreign to me. I didn't really know what I was grappling with entering into a sort of commercial publishing landscape. And so I will sort of preface this by saying, like, as a writer, as a speaker, as a thinker, I think I'm often feeling a little bit pulled in many directions in terms of those commitments of each realm that I sort of occupy, the scholarly and the literary and the sort of commercial publishing landscape. So if today seems like it's pulling in many constellations, sort of many directions, that would be why. But I felt like that publishing world offered me a little bit more creative freedom and the opportunity to pursue a kind of wider range of interests in my writing. All of which is to say, I am not a literary scholar. I'm not a literary scholar, and I don't see myself as a critic, but rather very much as a practitioner of creative writing with a research background in my subject matter. And so I sort of come at things from these two angles very, very often. So what follows is very much from the lens of a practitioner, thinking about this as a writer. And it may seem very preoccupied with the question of practice, of creative writing as a practice, as we discuss, say, the prospects for bearing witness to the more than human world in a moment of real environmental change and crisis. So I want to begin here, now that I've sort of situated myself, I want to begin here with a little bit of a context on nature writing. So there is this conventional history of nature writing in the Anglo-American tradition, right? It goes a little bit like this. This is like the very condensed, very potted version. In 1789, Gilbert White published the Natural History of Selborne, which is an epistolary text that bore witness not simply the biological and geological world of Selborne in Hampshire, but being written in the first person also offered something of a more intimate portrait of place. So this text is seen in Britain very much as foundational to the genre of nature writing. In 1854, on the other side of the pond, in the US, we've got Henry David Thoreau publishing Walden, which is likewise this, poetic and scientific portrait of place, but also kind of a spiritual call for a kind of self-sufficiency, which obviously has critically been unpacked in recent years. But very often these are treated as kind of two root stocks, male, white, inarguably important to what we understand as nature writing today. So this is very much the conventional history of nature writing. But there is, I think, another genealogy we might take. So I've long been a reader of Raymond Williams, whose book, The Country and the City, demonstrated to me that the exactness with which we might locate a beginning point for quote unquote nature writing really leads to frustration. I think, like, if we're thinking about nature writing capaciously, Raymond Williams is instructive in terms of, eliminating that conventional history that starts with Gilbert White. Williams takes this generous, capacious approach to searching for rural literature, and he finds traces of what we might now call nature writing in the early pastoral and beyond. In this collection, Reading the Roots, Michael Branch offers myriad early examples of North American writing about wilderness, I put this in quotes on my page, that precede Thoreau. So there are traces of what we call nature writing in theories of the picturesque and the sublime and the romantic, which is to ask, what do we mean when we say nature writing? right? Especially within the Anglo-American tradition. The OED gives us nature writing as first used in 1901 to to describe the work of Wordsworth and his peers. So, the OED is tracing it directly back to the Romantics. That's a kind of different lineage here. But conventional uses of the term now, when we speak of nature writing in a contemporary publishing frame, and this is where I say it's important to note that I sort of also occupy this world of commercial publishing. Uses of that term speak to something perhaps a bit different. Nonfiction primarily, prose typically, a melding of the personal with the scientific. So this is another conventional definition of nature writing, which I'm hoping we can stretch and mold. In 1962, Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, and in 1973 in Britain, Richard Mabey published The Unofficial Countryside. So one might, to contextualize nature writing within the contemporary publishing context, treat these two texts as likewise foundational, and they often are treated as foundational. Indeed, Joss Smith, who's a scholar at UEA, he's both a practitioner of writing and a critic, literary critic and scholar who's worked really extensively on nature writing. In his book on the contemporary tradition, of which I consider my own work a part, often called the new nature writing, Joss takes Mabey as his starting point for what we call the new nature writing in Britain. And by the 90s, we see the rise of writers like Roger Deakin, whose book Waterlog is up on the screen, who does this sort of melding of cultural and place history, really a contrast with Richard Mabey's more scientific approach. And this really, I think, is something that has become synonymous with what the new nature writing is in the contemporary British publishing landscape. It's here we might also locate kind of one of the ongoing rifts and conflicts in what nature writing can be and sort of in the discourse surrounding it. And it's that between, nature writing that privileges the scientific and that which privileges the personal, the cultural, or the aesthetic. Very often these sort of get like spread into two different camps and everyone's told to stay put where they are. The latter, this sort of more like personal, cultural, aesthetic mode, common say to Robert Macfarlane's work or the work of Helen Macdonald, for example. This has really become a dominant form, I would say, in the past 15 years or so. Now, what I find as a practitioner really interesting in this split is, of course, the notion that it is, in some sense, I think, an artificial one, placed upon books and authors in retrospect and largely by critics. And I'm speaking here of like publishing industry critics. There are books, of course, that give more weight to botany or zoology or other scientific ways of knowing. And there are books that really mine a writer's personal life and personal connection with a place as a way of knowing. And these polls have become really value-laden, I think, in recent discourse. But we may all perhaps already agree that the scientific-minded approach to nature writing is as much a cultural way of knowing as the aesthetic, right? And, it carries its own risks of, say, reifying Cartesian distinctions between the self and the world, nature as object to be studied and understood, right? It's not without its own sort of, cultural values and contexts attached. And we may likewise agree that a nature writing that centers the human self risks failing to account for the complexity of the more than human world. And in that failure to decenter the human becomes, I don't know, simply an echo chamber, perhaps. And this is something I see really often in critiques of contemporary nature memoir. Nature merely as a mirror for the author. And this is not, I would say, an insignificant risk, particularly in a genre that is currently dominated by memoir as a form. I think this is a really important sort of risk to hold in mind. As a sidebar, I think this is important for me to note in this context. I think it's important to note one of the key differences between, say, Taiwanese nature writing and British nature writing. Because from what I've read and understood of the Taiwanese nature writing tradition, the political is, and largely always has been, at the forefront of contemporary Taiwanese nature writing. Writing as protest through martial law, writing as advocacy for conservation. And It's not lost on me that the roots of the British tradition in Romanticism is often, I don't know, we might say it's quite different from, say, the influence of advocacy books like Silent Spring upon the Taiwanese tradition. It has not always been assumed that British or even North American nature writing is explicitly political, which is in itself a kind of point of contention. And so I think I just sort of want to touch on this briefly to situate this importance of like each tradition having its own sort of form of political engagement, and well, you'll see I'm gonna call attention to sort of the need for more political engagement within the British genre particularly. Okay, but the critique of the new nature writing and this divide between, say, writing about the natural world in sort of more scientific ways and more memoir-based cultural writing, I think points to something of contention that I want to unpack somewhat today through the example of the garden. That what is often called the new nature writing, I would argue, has drifted all too often towards the apolitical, and that the genre has often uncritically accepted ideas of wilderness or nature as salve, as, you know, retreat, as healing. Our current world, I would argue, as a practitioner of nature writing, demands forms and possibilities that lay somewhere between these poles, and perhaps well beyond them. How can we write of a world in crisis, climate crisis, biodiversity loss, drought, flooding, fires, and storms, with a form that boxes nature into the role simply of healer? How do we grapple with a concept like the Anthropocene, now rejected officially, while unpacking the sort of anthropocentrism at its heart? How can we write for a world in movement where identities and senses of belonging have shifted, are shifting, and will continue to do so at an increasing rate in more fraught ways as the crises I've mentioned continue? From a craft perspective, as an author, I think of how the formal conventions of a genre often reflect our preconceptions about the world around us, right? Whether that's as linear, as personal, as scientific. And as a human community looking at this crisis, these crises, I kind of want to throw my entire craft toolbox out the window very often, and throw it at the problem, really, and ask, you know, how else might we find ways to bear witness? So what I've got on the screen here are some screenshots from pieces that were in you know, literary magazines, newspapers, etc., written by critics, really sort of bemoaning the state of nature writing, the sort of apolitical nature of nature writing, calling for a more engaged nature writing. And I don't necessarily agree with all of these critiques, but I think it's a really important call for us as practitioners of the genre to grapple with, and also to sort of like unpack the sort of background of these critiques. But okay, I feel it's important to say that when I think about, you know, form in this talk, I'm speaking primarily about how in creative writing, we might find both form and content that allow us to better reflect the complications of the world as we currently find it. A form perhaps that pushes us to bleed across the boundaries of memoir and natural history writing, or perhaps that breaks the conventions that keep prose and poetry apart. One that rejects ideas of linearity, of teleological narrative, of fiction and nonfiction as intrinsically distinct, and one that leans into the power, I say, perhaps of negative space on the page. And I, you know, some of this, I think, for those of us who are avid readers, who might be literary scholars, it might seem obvious, like, yes, hybrid form is really interesting. But I think within the nature writing sphere in the current publishing landscape, it's not a done deal. It's not taken as a given. And I think there's something still really to be pushed in this frame. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Yeah. Oh, shall I move a bit over to be on the camera? Okay, sorry. I hope everyone can still hear me okay. I'm just gonna move my thing over. Okay. We might speak of these kinds of texts that I've pointed towards here as hybrid texts, which, like the hybridity of plants, animals, or people, invites us to think about having two or more ways of being or functions. And in the frame of the environmental humanities, I asked myself what this word hybrid, it says on a hybrid talk, offers for describing our more than human world. In the era some have called the Anthropocene, and those among us who exist in ways that defy strict borders or categorical rules, what we might find in this sort of idea of hybridity when we come to thinking about practicing as nature writers, reading as readers of nature writers, and hybrid beings in many ways. So what I promised to talk about, oh, did I miss a slide? I think I've missed a slide. So I'm just going to read through here what I think about hybrids, which is this idea of like rejecting the sort of the poles that are at the heart of that critique of nature writing, right? Looking for more playful ways of being as practitioners. So I promised to talk about gardens today. I'm going to talk about gardens now. The garden, I think, provides a really fruitful space in which to question these conventional binaries, wild and domesticated, human and more than human, and to explore hybridity in the genre of nature writing. So this interest, I will say, is partly personal for me. I'm an avid balcony gardener. I've been told I get to see the rooftop garden later, and I'm very excited about this. And I will say my most recent book, Dispersals, which I will hold up, so folks can see it. This is Dispersals. This is the UK cover. You might also see the US cover drifting around. This is the US cover, depending on where folks are. And there's also a different cover for Taiwan. Comes out today. Okay. Dispersals was in part a meditation on what it means to plant a garden as a person who moves, who migrates, who cannot see through the long-term care of a garden, right? What does it mean to plant something when you can't even stick around to see it grow? The ways gardens may signify hope, yes, but also the ways in which gardens have, I think, really largely remained inaccessible to so many, depending on wealth, class, race, migration history, and other factors. I'm interested especially in the ways gardens may signify something entirely different depending on one's cultural context. So for example, in the first chapter of this book, I spent some time thinking about my mother's conceptions of beauty and landscape and the garden, because so many of her understandings of what makes a garden beautiful are very much premised on the idea of gardens in Taiwan and of like Chinese traditional gardens. She very much comes to it with this frame. And I sort of trace her efforts to recreate those gardens repeatedly throughout my childhood in Canada. And then the sort of final essay, that's the opening essay of the book, and the final essay of the book looks at my inherited ideas of beauty and their links to empire and ideas of natural beauty from Britain as really shaping my understanding of not just gardens, but landscape and what it means to call a landscape beautiful. So these kinds of questions are really at the heart of this book. In the Anglo-American tradition, the garden kind of has this conventional narrative attached to it, right? It's something I think many of us will be familiar with. We've got an enclosed paradise, right? And we might begin with Eden, the Garden of Eden, the garden in which Adam and Eve were given riches, only to be cast out from for seeking knowledge. The garden here is a space that serves as this contrast to the wider world beyond its walls. Harriet Ritvo, writing of how we classify nature as wild and domesticated, writes that it is at least as easy to put the garden on the tame or domesticated side of the ledger as it is to classify the wolf as a wild animal. So when we're thinking about gardens, we're very much grappling with these binaries between sort of, domesticated and wild. The garden is a space understood to have a border, to have a wall, perhaps invisible, but nonetheless a border of some sort that distinguishes it from wilderness beyond. Even if that border is merely symbolic, right? It's a way of ordering how we care for the natural world. So the garden comes value laden as a space of work repaid in botanical bounty, a space of control and care and cultivation, or perhaps domination. In the 18th century in Britain, we see the rise of the garden as this space of leisure. This is something that I did a lot of my doctoral work around, thinking about histories of landscape gardens in particular. a space of aesthetic beauty that's, really carefully cultivated to reflect a curated vision of rural nature. So I'm thinking of like gardens by, say, Capability Brown and Humphrey Repton, a lot of the 18th century sort of picturesque landscape gardens. And then in the 20th century, of course, we see this rise of the idea of the backyard garden, right? The garden as like an everyman's thing that we should all aspire to and have. The garden as a space of hobby and pastime for any homeowner. And I think this is an important sort of cultural context to offer for those who might not be familiar with the British obsession with gardening. Has anyone heard of like Gardener's Question Time? Okay. In Britain, I always feel like this is important to mention. In Britain, there is a radio show on BBC Radio 4 that is, I think, one of the most listened to things in the country, and it's Gardener's Question Time. And it is just, it's ubiquitous. Like it's a cultural thing that everyone sort of participates in, whether or not they have a garden. It's like a call-in show where you can ask questions about your garden, all of which is to say, gardening becomes this thing that's like, it is for everyone, whether or not you have a garden, right? And there's this like preoccupation in the national identity with the idea of gardening as a practice. So this sort of sits in the background of everything I'm saying. The garden, essentially, we could say, is a space apart where the dance between human and more than human agency is very carefully choreographed. But as Olivia Lang in this newer book writes in The Garden Against Time, this idea of the garden as an island unto itself is actually not quite possible in practice, right? I think many of us will be on board with this idea. She writes, while the spell of the garden does lie in its suspension, its seeming separation from the larger world, the idea that it exists outside of history or politics is not a possibility. A garden is a time capsule as well as a portal out of time, right? So we have this simultaneous push to hold the garden out as separate from the world, but of course that is value laden. It comes with its own very specific histories. So in Dispersals, as I said, I begin with my mother's understanding of natural beauty, right, and link that to her love of ponds in particular in Chinese gardens. And I trace my own shifting relationships to plants and gardens, particularly as within the course of the book, while I was writing Dispersals, so it happens in the book, and also it happened to me in real life while I was writing the book. I moved house 3 times. And then I closed the book with this meditation on what it means to inherit this idea of natural beauty growing up in a colony where empire is held as the ideal for natural beauty. So there's, there are ideas of the garden and its beauty as inherited from sort of 2 poles, from my mother and from this sort of, my dad's British, and also, growing up in Canada, I think our education system gives us a certain framework to work within. And then, throughout the center of the book, it's really predicated on this idea of like gardens that I cannot stay with, gardens that I cannot see through. The garden for me is a space that pulls between solace and loss, empire and colony, home and migration. So for me, automatically, the themes of the garden are very different from this original conventional reading of the garden as like a space of retreat and idyll. It's a space for me of complication, and a place where I attempt to ask what it means to connect with the more than human worlds in a moment of global change. The garden is a space in which to engage with futurity, even when the outlook remains really bleak. And so there's one chapter, which I'm going to read a quote from. It's a chapter about seeds. What would it be to stay in a place long enough to save its seeds? I ask at the end of this chapter. It's a chapter about seed saving and seed banking and gardens. I do not yet know the answer, but I hope I might. I do know that when I planted these seeds in my backyard garden in Cambridge, I was 40 weeks pregnant. Surely I believe in some kind of future. In her meditation on creating a garden to attract monarch butterflies into her Toronto backyard, the environmental humanities scholar and one of my mentors, Kate Sandilands, asks about the nature of hope and whether hope in our moment is misplaced. I think of these questions from time to time when I buy seeds or when I plant the next season's garden. or think of creating a beauty that cannot last? Would time better be spent agitating for social change? What use is a single garden, or indeed in my case, a single seed? Saving seeds is an act of belief in a future that the present tells me cannot exist, but I do it anyway. Two things can be true at once. The garden is a space for me that invites hybridity, both in form and content. Now, broadly speaking, in nature writing, the garden is a space that I think reifies many of the tropes that dominate nature writing, right? The things I talked about earlier. Ideas of rootedness, of belonging on or in a single place, of this kind of durational engagement. I think very often in the nature writing genre, we've seen texts. I'm thinking, for example, the work of James Rebanks, who writes about being a sheep farmer in the Lake District where his family has farmed for literally 400 years, right? The genre has become, I think, really like shaped by these kinds of narratives about durational belonging and what it means to engage with a single place over a long, long period of time. We have a long history of publications essentially about staying put, about cultivating a single plot of land over a long period of time. So what I want to explore here, and what I think I really try to explore in dispersals and in my own practice, is whether there are alternative possibilities from, say, a simple idyll or retreat or this kind of durational belonging mode for the garden in nature writing. So back to Olivia Lang. In this book, we have an initial sight of a garden as solace that becomes more complicated. So as she moves through the book, she sort of starts with that conventional history and then by turns, chapter by chapter, adds layers of complication. I'll just read this quote from pretty early in the book. As the terrors of the plague year grew, this half imaginary, half real garden became a place of solace to me. A zone apart that I could enter at will, even though I'd only seen it once. So she's seen a garden in a house, decided to buy that house some months later. And so she moves in about 8 months after first seeing it. So we've got this very conventional reading of the garden as this like space of solace and retreat. This sounds like an idiosyncratic activity, but I was by no means alone in finding the garden a place of consolation that spring. While I was in bed, an unlikely obsession with gardening had taken hold. Did anyone here get really into gardening during the pandemic? Was that a thing? I see at least one hand go up. My sister, who was never a plant person, is the most intense gardener, and she's amazing at it. And it was a pandemic hobby, which I find really interesting as a long-term gardener. Okay, so all across the world, people were engaged in this feverish new love affair with plants. More recent nature writing texts on gardens, especially those written through the pandemic, I think are filled with these sorts of tensions, right? Of like the garden becoming this sort of complicated space of retreat, but also real difficulty and tension, especially for those who became gardeners during the pandemic. So the books I want to talk about are very much from like the past few years and should be sort of read with that context of like recent gardening through the pandemic in mind. How might a nature writing tradition that for quite some time I think has been dominated by notions of the natural world as solace, as retreat, grapple with more complicated understandings of the garden? So I'm going to look at a few contemporary texts, and I want to unpack some of the sort of thematic and formal possibilities of the garden in these texts. So the first example I've pulled is from the garden journalist and writer Alice Vincent's memoir from 2020, Rootbound, which I think I'm sort of presenting first as I would argue it presents perhaps this more conventional take on the garden, and also perhaps on the nature memoir as a form. The book traces Alice Vincent's childhood and young adulthood as she develops a love of plants, interweaving a very like millennial coming of age memoir with a meditation on what it means to garden as a young woman in the city. She lives in London with very limited access to outdoor space. Ultimately, she plants a thriving balcony garden and devotes her career to actually becoming a gardening journalist. So Alice was for quite a long time the gardening columnist for the Times of London, and she writes a gardening newsletter. She's like, if people think millennial gardening writer, it's Alice Vincent in the UK. Like that's the space she's sort of cultivated for herself. Now, this book, Rootbound, was her first book. Formally, it is written with pretty standard chapters and paragraphs, very little stylistic play. There's nothing about it that is, you would pick it up and say, ooh, this is like particularly surprising. But I do think she really skillfully captures her connection to plants in this book. So she writes, "For me, the plants that moved me were the outside ones, those that persevered regardless of the weather, those that existed to contribute to the greater world around them, that fed the bees and shed their leaves and threatened death in winter only to surge back with a long-forgotten vengeance with the promise of spring. I'd been pushing to be outside for months, to move beyond the boundaries I'd unwittingly raised around me, of the notion of what my life would be. I'd lingered restlessly indoors out of not knowing how to escape it. Maybe that was why the air on the balcony gave me a better reason to exhale. Maybe that was why I found retreat in the walled gardens over the road." There is, I think, in this early passage from the book, a sense of the garden and plants as having a kind of agency in calling her forth, in calling her outside, calling her into this space of engagement. But likewise, the garden here still provides this escape from a difficult home life and heartbreak, right? The garden here, though it is alive and vibrant, seems to have a power of its own, but it is still portrayed as a space for her to find emotional retreat in this book. The text likewise incorporates elements of garden and botanical history interwoven with memoir. So Vincent traces, for example, the history of plant taxonomy, writing, "As words have complex etymological histories, so do plants have their rich backstories. Explorerships and conquest, money and persuasion, smuggling and an absence of scruples and pride and keeping of appearances. These are the mechanisms that placed plants in our possession." I would argue, actually, that this is where I think the text sort of falls short, however, in really grappling with the sort of exploitative history of plant transfers and botanical exploration. This is about as much as Vincent says on the subject in the book, which I think is really important, because this was seen as like one of the really big gardening memoirs of the past sort of decade within the British nature writing scene. I think it's sort of, Vincent never quite like fully interrogates the power dynamics at hand in the stories of plants brought into the garden, into her garden, especially. And this, I think, is where a lot of the revolutionary power of the contemporary garden as a writer, like it's where that power may lie and what is missed, I think, here in this text. Vincent, admittedly, I want to sort of say this really explicitly, she's already picked up on this and has pointed to the naivete in this first book's treatment of history. And in her second book, and I believe in the book she's writing now, in more recent texts, has really sought to revisit this, particularly her second book, Why Women Grow, which is much more politically engaged and much more engaged with histories of colonization and oppression in thinking about the garden. And so, I sort of introduced this as important to thinking about like this conventional mold of what nature writing in the garden has given us, and perhaps some of the shortcomings, and also that writers they are critically engaging with this. By contrast, I want to turn to another very recent book. It just came out last year. And this is Marshall Farrell's 2023 memoir, Uprooting. I don't know if anyone has seen this. This book won the Nan Shepherd Prize in the UK. Actually, I was one of the judges that awarded the book that prize. So Farrell's text, like I said, it was published following its win of the Nan Shepherd Prize, and this prize offers a book deal to a nature writer who's the framework is like not typically represented by the genre or the publishing industry. So writers who do not feel themselves to be belonging to the dominant sort of culture of that industry. I will say that this is fairly self-defined by the prize. It could be writers of color, disabled writers, working class writers, writers for whom English is not their first language. There's all sorts of frameworks for how this prize sort of positions itself. But Marshall is one of the recent winners of this prize, and the book just came out last year. So in the book, Farrell, who is from Trinidad, traces her early years as a migrant in Britain and her eventual cultivation of a garden in the English countryside. So already we know this is going to be like it comes value laden in a lot of ways. This is a story that is going to grapple with those themes automatically. This is a book that, it traces all the complications of being the only Black person in her small village, and the kind of complicated political history of what it means for her to tend a garden. She doesn't feel straightforwardly comfortable about this idea at first, though she loves plants and loves gardening. So like Vincent's text, this book is, I would say, written in a sort of standard chapter format, with each chapter titled by a plant in her garden. So Farrell begins the book with a strong sense of the garden as a refuge for her. She gardens through the early months of the pandemic, but she quickly finds the peace of it disrupted in the summer of 2020, following the death of George Floyd and the sort of rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm going to read this quote. "After years of staring down dark tunnels looking for the light at the end, I stand here in this winter light-filled room and wonder, what next? Part of me desperately wants to root into this place and feel at home here. But my whole life and the lives of generations before me have been spent in such a constant state of upheaval and flux that I wonder if I can. Empire created the shockwaves that set us adrift. Now here I am on my very own plot of imperial land." So she's tackling the garden explicitly as political, from the outset of this book. Or as she writes later in response to racism in the gardening world, and she's looking particularly at, I think, like a bit of a furore over like social media amongst like gardening accounts and like gardening influencers, which is quite interesting. She says, "I take my rage back into the garden. It can never be a place of uncomplicated sanctuary for me, never be a haven of escape from the pain of the world around me, because it carries the history of all the pain that my ancestors went through in relation to the land." So the garden for Farrell is explicitly tied to the transatlantic slave trade, to her own sort of complicated legacies, and those like inheritances of being Caribbean in Britain, particularly in the past sort of decades, following the Windrush scandal. I don't know if folks are particularly familiar with Windrush, but essentially in Britain, whole like decades worth of folks who had come from the Caribbean to Britain as workers, later found out that many of their documents were not considered valid, that they didn't have rights to residency, rights to access public services in Britain. Some folks were deported. It was hugely controversial, and this happened within the sort of past 10 years or so. And so this is like gardening while Black in Britain, I think right now carries very much like the ties to like not only the transatlantic slave trade as sort of history, but also contemporary histories of exploitation and oppression as it's affected, like, the Windrush. Many of those people were people who came over in the 50s. And so current contemporary generations who are being denied their rights in similar ways. So this is all sort of in the context of this book. There's a lot going on here. Now, Farrell's book gestures towards a plant world that is alive with the powers of itself, right? So there's one of the images throughout the book is of bindweed, which is a particularly rapacious weed. I'll put that in air quotes. It creeps over her land despite her efforts repeatedly to eradicate it. The garden holds the tensions of generational trauma as much as it holds a healing power for her. And she meditates quite a lot on healing plants and knowledge from her grandmothers and from previous generations of plants, and the ways plant knowledge and plant healing knowledge has been lost. And so we've got this sort of like tension of like the garden kind of as a space that constellates trauma and healing together. While both this book and Vincent's approach to gardening, both of these books, I think, really use the lens of a formally straightforward memoir, with very little play or experimentation on the page. They do offer this sense of the garden becoming more than perhaps a simple retreat or sort of idyll in contemporary nature writing. I think this book offers us something really, really interesting to mull. Okay, the final example I want to look at in depth comes from Keo McClear's Unearthing. Has anyone seen this book or read this book? Okay, so like one or two people. Read this book. It's incredible. I'm obsessed with it. It is so good. Really, really, really worth it. So Kyo McClear is a Canadian British Japanese writer. So she was born to a Japanese mother. She was born in Britain, and then they moved to Canada, and she grew up there. And she works across nonfiction, children's literature, and illustration. And in doing so, I think really offers this entire opus of works whose hybridity is, it's really explicit and it really grasps at this world's complexity. I think that's one of her real skills as a writer. In her most recent nonfiction book, Unearthing, it's a book about learning that her father is not her biological father. So the person who raised her, who she always thought was her father, she finds out sort of later in life was not her father. And the book sort of traces her seeking to regain lost memories from her mother while gardening. So her mother is suffering from dementia, and through the process of gardening together, she kind of tries to recoup the fragments of that past history that led to her not knowing who her father was. So it's like this tension of like gardening as this channel for knowledge exchange and memory exchange. So the book offers us that, but it also offers us the starkness of the climate crisis as really entwined with that sort of like personal journey, like how do you live in a time of crisis? How do you hold hope? How do you move forward in a moment, like, to quote sort of myself earlier, when like the world tells you you shouldn't even have hope? And here I think, climate crisis, the sort of more than human world is not simply a backdrop in the book. It's not a backdrop to personal crisis. They're really, really entwined quite strongly in this book. So her writing about gardening with her mother is inflected by these appeals to like a much wider world. It is a book, I will say, unlike the other two that I've mentioned, that is marked by really noticeable formal play, which is a subject I'm going to return to in a little bit. I want to read you quite a long passage. It goes over a couple slides, but I feel like it's worth reading. Quite a long passage that I think offers a real sense of the entanglement with which McClear approaches writing the garden. So you'll see the garden doesn't appear till the end of what I'm about to read, but I will read it to you. This is from sort of like midway, 2/3 of the way through the book. As I said, her mother is suffering from dementia. Kyo is a writer and artist, so she's gone away on a residency, and her mother is back home, and the sort of distance becomes marked. And it's in this moment, over the course of the book, where she's been trying to trace her family history and her family story while gardening with her mother. So all of these sort of threads are running in parallel at once. In my residency room, the phone rings through the night, every few hours or minutes. 22 straight calls. My mother is unanchored by my absence. Her voice tumbles into the quiet in the form of random questions and statements. Wake up. At 4 a.m., unable to settle back to sleep, I blurrily scroll through my phone. A whiplash of content that does nothing to soothe my twitching mind. The salty chocolate pudding is very good. Australia is burning. Blood orange skies and pink Martian suns. Blazing forests and trees reduced to charcoal poles. It is an otherworldly scene. Omnicide will be the word used by Danielle Sellermeyer. I apologize if I pronounced that wrong. A professor of sociology at the University of Sydney, to describe the previously unwitnessed horror of Australia's 2019-2020 bushfire season. Humans, animals, trees, insects, fungi, ecosystems, forests, rivers, and on being killed in recent years. Environmentalists have coined the term ecocide, the killing of ecosystems. But there is something more. This is the killing of everything. Wake up. So the passage continues. It's the detachment, my photographer uncle says when he emails me old pictures of my parents and me. He has an eye and notices things like the hint of intimacy or aloofness in a gap between two bodies. The mini proofs of affection and distance. Note the cool demeanor, Uncle A writes. Her shoulder turned slightly away, barely perceptible, her eyes elsewhere, not upon him or even you. The odd sense of mutual alienation. So we're here seeing this sort of like the narrative strand of her trying to trace her family history here. The next fragment section here. My mother continues to leave voicemails through the night. Wake up, Kyo-chan. Honest is very important. That's what Oscar Wilde said a long time ago. I don't know what to say. English is my second language. Koaikyo-chan, I know you were a sweetie pie. I brought you up almost by myself, and Daddy, he loved you. No, no, I mean, Michael, I think you believe friends and students are more important than family. But I have a big question mark about that. I try to do my best. Okay, desu. Please call mommy. Arigato. I'm getting crazy about these things. Why don't you call? Why do you have to speak in English? Don't you remember who I am? I will say, as the daughter of a Taiwanese mother, for whom like these linguistic tensions between sort of one's native language and English as inherited as dominant, I wept when I read this passage the first time. I return home to find my mother has jerry-rigged a complicated scaffold for our amaryllis with chopsticks and twist ties. The full moon tampers with our hearts. Across the city, the moon gleams over the greenhouse, and somewhere inside it, pressed to glass, are 5 amaryllis keening for their cousins in Australia. All those plants down under are gobbling up the poison in the sky. Amaryllis can survive fire, but how much fire and for how long? Q McClear, like me, is trained in the environmental humanities and brings that knowledge to bear on the page. Hers is a world where omnicide, dementia, familial stories, and their omission, linguistic code switching, and houseplants exist, interpenetrated by one another. The story moves between all, together and at once, entangled. The garden is a space of questioning. She gently probes her mother for information on her biological father as they garden together, while never losing sight of the ways in which her story is but a small one in a more complicated, agential world of other creatures and plants and life forms. McClear, interestingly, experiments extensively with form in this text, making use of poetic structures, fragments, illustrations, and more straightforward memoir, depending on the section. So I really think, like, if you come across this book, it's really worth picking up because it's a book where you open it and every page looks different than the next. She plays with margins, she plays with white space, she plays with lists, with paragraphs, with poetry, with image. There's a lot going on. No chapter is like another in this book. It's a real joy to read. As such, the book feels, I think, formally much more like a garden, we might say. We're asked to look here, to attend to this sort of rock-like stack of words, to move down the tangled path of a particular story, to find ourselves then open into a clearing of flowing text. I have that sensation when I read this book. It is like moving through a garden. It is a text that more than asks us to part with the idea that the garden becomes a space of escape from the world. In this text, it is instead the garden becomes a place of connection, of kinship, both between Kyo and her mother, but likewise with the more than human world she's collaborating with to grow that garden. So in one chapter, which I've copied a little bit of it out for you so you could see it. McClear examines the ways culturally significant gardens are experienced. So she's not just talking about her garden, she talks about various gardens around Toronto where she lives, but also various gardens around the world. So she takes the example of Giverny, where Monet famously painted his water lilies. So this is a garden all of us, or an image at least that many of us might be familiar with, the Monet's water lilies. And in this chapter where she talks about it, she toggles paragraph by paragraph between Monet, between her own mother, who visited the garden at a moment of personal crisis in her marriage, and the artist Derek Jarman, who is himself famous for his own garden at Prospect Cottage in the south of England, but who also visited Giverny. So she traces like these 3 stories, and every paragraph we're moved back and forth between them in a way that I find really compelling. So I have another long passage to give you a sense of what she enrolls in the space of this garden. My mother walked around Giverny. This was how she chose to mark her independence. To what do we commit ourselves, and for how long? Monet painted the Nymphaeas 247 times. It took me some time to understand my water lilies, he wrote. The older I get, the more I understand this impulse towards reduction and repetition. The more I understand, there is infinitude in a Spartan focus, in Agnes Martin's geometries, in Giorgio Morandis' vases. Focalizing can be regenerative, even for those of us who believe the sprawling clamor of the world demands our promiscuous attention. 247 times. A marriage may have as many incarnations, some more satisfying, some more frustrating than others. Love can be revised and resurrected after a long dormancy. It is possible, when a couple finally collapses, to grieve the better incarnations that are also dissolved. There is a photo of Derek Jarman by the pond at Giverny, standing on a small arched Japanese bridge against a blooming bank of wisteria. Jarman visited many famous gardens, but this was to be his final excursion before his death from AIDS complications in 1994. Like Monet, his sight was failing, and perhaps this deepened the bond he felt with the earlier artist. In his book, Smiling in Slow Motion, Jarman describes Giverny as a delight and the shaggiest garden in the world, surely a compliment for a place tended by full-time gardeners and coming from an artist plantsman who celebrated shagginess as coup against the monotony of too much human agency. That's a quote. The quote she offers here is, "If a garden isn't shaggy, forget it." So here we have the garden as a space of long attention, a space of path breaking and independence, of rebellion perhaps, also a space of passing through, depending on the position in each paragraph, right, who we're speaking about. But we likewise have a space for making space, for more than human agencies, for that shagginess, for transition, for death and new life. So, thinking about Jarman and tending a garden knowing that he was going to die, thinking about her mother contemplating whether to stay or go in the marriage through the sort of medium of this garden. We have a space for more than human agencies, for transition, for death and new life. And MacLear gives us these gardens as messy, as complicated, as entwined deeply with the world. And I think this is where formally she gives us that messiness on the page, that we're not going to run from one paragraph to the next in this sort of teleological narrative. We're not going to have a chronology that makes sense. We're not going to have a straightforward use of the page, that we're forced to sort of be on our toes as readers as we navigate the sort of messy garden of this book. Okay, so I'm coming near the end. I want to finish and kind of note that these are just a few examples, I think, of contemporary nature writing that take the garden as central, and I think push us forward in our sense of what the garden may be within contemporary nature writing. So for me, I will say, like, as a practitioner, this sort of really seeing what's possible in terms of how we can exercise our subject matter formally on the page in the way that MacLear does, I think has been really important. It helped me think a lot about, like, how I want to write going forward, what's possible, what I wish I could have done in dispersals. Actually, in a lot of ways, it's a really sort of compelling idea for me. But also these sort of more straightforward texts, thinking about how we can just sort of interweave thematically a lot of those tensions, even into, like, sort of a more conventional narrative. These are basically texts that have really just pushed me to imagine how the world on the page can more rightly reflect, I think, the world beyond it. So to close, I'm just going to turn to one more quote from MacLear. Later in the book, in a chapter of short fragments, she writes, "I remember metaphor is a way of making family out of seemingly unrelated things." In this line, we may find her family with her non-biologically related father, right? But we may likewise find the garden as a space of incongruous stories exchanged between her and her mother, or if we're thinking of Farrell's text, of, finding that solace and also holding generational trauma and the tensions of that together. A space of political or social tension, but above all, a space for other beings, pushing against the soil to become indifferent, perhaps, to her tending. A space where I think kinship may be found. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much.